In Millbrook's quiet streets, a 68-year-old widow was about to turn public humiliation into powerful defiance. What started as her grandson's birthday party took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter-in-law's cruel dismissal. Stela Jones wasn't your typical grandmother. For 37 years, she had shaped young minds as an elementary teacher, known for her quiet strength and unwavering dignity. When Ashley declared old people don't belong at parties, Stela had no idea she was walking into a battle for family respect. Her response, throwing an elaborate celebration while excluding Ashley, would lead to a community-wide awakening about the true value of elder wisdom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Stela Jones adjusted the rearview mirror one final time before stepping out of her well-worn Honda Civic, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pristine driveway of David and Ashley's modern colonial. In her hands, she cradled a glass cake carrier containing 3 layers of chocolate cake with vanilla buttercream, Jake's favorite since he was old enough to voice preferences. The recipe had been Robert's grandmother's, passed down through generations, and Stela had started baking it at 5:30 that morning, humming softly to herself in the quiet kitchen where Robert's coffee mug still sat in its usual spot by the window. The frosting roses had taken her nearly an hour to perfect. Each delicate petal was crafted with the same attention she'd once given to bulletin board displays in her 3rd-grade classroom. At 68, her hands weren't quite as steady as they once were, but muscle memory and love guided the pastry bag with practiced precision. This wasn't just a cake. It was a grandmother's devotion made tangible, a connection to family tradition that transcended the growing distance she felt creeping into family gatherings. Through the large bay windows, she could see the party already in full swing. Balloons in coordinated blues and silvers, Jake's favorite colors this year, bobbed from weighted clusters, and she caught glimpses of children darting between perfectly arranged furniture. Ashley's event planning background showed in every detail, from the professional photographer capturing candid moments to the elaborate dessert table that could have been featured in a magazine spread. Stela paused at the front door, suddenly aware of how her simple blue cardigan and pearl earrings might appear against the backdrop of Ashley's carefully curated aesthetic. She'd dressed with care, choosing the outfit Robert had always said brought out her eyes, but now she wondered if she looked dated, out of step with the modern celebration unfolding inside. "Grandma Stela!" Jake's voice cut through her momentary uncertainty as the door swung open. 8 years old, and all knees and elbows, he launched himself into her arms with the unguarded affection that made her heart swell. His face was already streaked with frosting from some earlier treat, and his Spider-Man t-shirt bore evidence of enthusiastic play. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she murmured against his hair, breathing in that unique scent of childhood, grass stains, bubblegum, and pure joy. "I brought you something special." His eyes widened as he spotted the cake carrier. "Did you make the roses? The pretty ones like last time?" "Of course I did. Each one made with extra love for my favorite grandson." "I'm your only grandson, Grandma." "That makes you even more special, doesn't it?" David appeared in the doorway, his software engineer's posture slightly hunched from too many hours at a computer, but his smile genuine as he reached for an awkward hug around the cake. "Hi, Mom. Thanks for coming." There was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that made her study his face. The fine lines around his eyes seemed deeper than she remembered, and she wondered if he was sleeping well. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she said, meaning every word. These moments with Jake were precious, becoming more infrequent as he grew older and life pulled the family in different directions. Ashley emerged from the kitchen, phone in one hand, coordinating with someone about timing. She looked stunning in a way that seemed effortless, but Stela knew required significant effort. Her dark hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her designer dress fitting like it had been tailored specifically for her frame. Everything about Ashley projected success, control, the kind of polished competence that Stela sometimes envied. "Oh." Ashley's eyes landed on the cake carrier, and Stela caught the micro-expression that flashed across her features before the polite smile appeared. "You brought a cake. How?" "Thoughtful." The pause before thoughtful hung in the air like a dropped note in a piano recital. Stela felt the familiar sting of being gently dismissed, the way Ashley had perfected over the years. Never outright rude, but somehow making it clear that Stella's contributions were quaint rather than valuable. "I thought Jake might enjoy having his favorite," Stela said, her voice steady despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest. "It's the family recipe I've been making for his birthday since he was 2. "Of course, that's very sweet." Ashley's attention was already shifting back to her phone. "We have the dessert table handled, but I'm sure we can find a spot for it somewhere." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Stela had spent 4 hours creating something with love, and it was being relegated to whatever corner might accommodate it. She watched as Ashley gestured toward an elaborate spread that included a 3-tier professional cake decorated with intricate fondant work, matching the party's color scheme perfectly. Jake tugged at her cardigan. "Can we put your cake next to the big one? They can be friends." The innocence of his suggestion made her chest tighten with affection, even as she felt the sting of comparison. Her homemade creation would look humble next to Ashley's designer confection, but Jake's excitement mattered more than her pride. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." As they moved deeper into the house, Stela took in the controlled chaos of a successful children's party. Parents clustered in small groups, nursing coffee and making polite conversation while keeping one eye on their offspring. The children moved in predictable patterns, the shy ones clinging to their parents' legs, the bold ones already claiming territory near the gift table, Jake's closest friends forming the nucleus around which the other activities orbited. "Mrs. Jones!" Sarah Peterson, one of Jake's classmates' mothers, approached with a warm smile. "How lovely to see you again. Jake talks about you constantly in carpool. Last week he told us all about how you taught him to identify different types of clouds." The warmth in Sarah's voice was genuine, and Stela felt some of her earlier tension ease. "He's such a curious boy, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things work. Just like his father at that age," she said, glancing fondly at David, who was helping set up what appeared to be an elaborate treasure hunt. "You did such a wonderful job raising him." The compliment hit its mark, filling a space in Stella's heart that had felt increasingly hollow lately. Since Robert's death, she'd struggled with questions of purpose and relevance. Her teaching days were long behind her, her mothering role had evolved into something less central, and widowhood had left her questioning what her place in the world really was. "Would you like me to help with the games?" Stela offered, watching as Ashley directed activities with the precision of a military operation. "I have some experience with children's parties." 37 years of teaching had given her a toolkit of crowd management strategies that had served her well through countless classroom celebrations, school carnivals, and family gatherings. She knew how to read a room of children, how to adjust energy levels, how to include the wallflowers while managing the attention seekers. Ashley looked up from her clipboard, because of course there was a clipboard, and Stela saw the moment of calculation in her eyes. The weighing of politeness against preference, the subtle assessment of whether Stela's help was welcome or simply something to be endured. "Oh, Stela," Ashley said, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that she'd perfected, not unkind, but somehow managing to make Stela feel both heard and dismissed simultaneously. "Old people don't belong at parties. Why don't you just sit and watch?" The words hit like a physical blow. Around them, conversation continued. Children laughed. The party photographer snapped candid shots, but Stela felt as if time had suddenly slowed, allowing each word to sink deep into her consciousness, where it could do maximum damage. "Old people don't belong at parties." The phrase echoed in her mind, gathering weight with each repetition. Not, "We have it handled," or, "Thank you, but we're all set." A blanket dismissal based purely on her age, her perceived irrelevance, spoken loud enough for other parents to hear, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed their words held no real consequence. Stela felt her face flush, the heat creeping up her neck as she became hyper-aware of every eye in the room. Had others heard? Were they looking at her differently now, seeing confirmation of what Ashley had just declared? That she was too old, too out of touch, too irrelevant to participate in something as simple as children's games? Of course, she managed, her voice smaller than she intended. But where was there to sit? The living room furniture had been rearranged to accommodate the party flow, and the remaining chairs were occupied by other parents who suddenly seemed decades younger than her own 68 years. She felt exposed, standing in the middle of the room with nowhere to retreat, holding her homemade cake that now seemed like a sad anachronism in this perfectly orchestrated celebration. Jake appeared at her side, his small hand slipping into hers. At 8, he possessed an intuitive understanding of emotional undercurrents that adults often missed, and she could see the confusion in his dark eyes as he looked between his grandmother and his mother. "Grandma, do you want to see my new Legos? They're upstairs in my room." The kindness in his offer nearly broke her composure. Here was this beautiful boy, trying to rescue her from a situation he didn't fully understand but recognized as hurtful. His gesture of protection was instinctive and pure, and it made Ashley's dismissal even more painful by contrast. "That sounds wonderful, honey. But this is your party. You should be with your friends. They'll still be here later. Come on." He tugged at her hand with gentle insistence, and she realized he was offering her exactly what she needed, an escape route that preserved everyone's dignity. "Just for a few minutes," she conceded, allowing herself to be led toward the stairs. As they climbed to his bedroom, she heard Ashley's voice floating up from below, bright and cheerful as she organized the next activity. The party continued without missing a beat, as if her presence or absence made no difference at all. The realization struck her with unexpected force. She had become incidental to her own grandson's celebration, a peripheral figure whose contributions were tolerated rather than valued. Jake's room was a sanctuary of childhood wonder, walls covered with art projects and science fair certificates, shelves lined with books she'd given him over the years. He pulled out his latest Lego creation, an elaborate space station that had clearly required hours of patient construction. "Look, Grandma, it has a docking bay and everything. I used the techniques you taught me about being patient and following instructions." She knelt beside him on the carpet, genuinely interested despite the emotional turmoil churning in her chest. This was what mattered, these moments of connection, the passing down of wisdom and values, the simple act of being present in a child's life. "It's magnificent, Jake. Tell me about this section here." For 20 minutes, she listened to his enthusiastic explanations, asked thoughtful questions, and offered gentle suggestions when he showed her modifications he was planning. This was where she belonged. Not managing party games, perhaps, but in the quiet moments where real relationships were built and maintained. When they finally returned downstairs, the party was winding down. Children were collecting goodie bags, parents were gathering jackets and lost shoes, and the careful choreography of departure was beginning. Stela retrieved her now empty cake carrier from the dessert table, noting that her cake had indeed been tucked into a corner, overshadowed by Ashley's elaborate creation. But Jake's friends had found it, and the evidence of their enjoyment, crumbs and empty plates, provided some small satisfaction. "Thank you for coming, Mom," David said as she prepared to leave. His hug was warmer this time, lasting a few seconds longer, and she wondered if he'd sensed the undercurrents of the earlier exchange. "Happy birthday, my sweet boy," she whispered to Jake, who clung to her waist with fierce affection. Ashley approached with Jake's younger sister Emma on her hip, offering a polite smile and air kisses that barely grazed Stella's cheeks. "Thanks for the cake, Stella. It was very thoughtful." The same word again, delivered with the same subtle dismissal. Stella managed a nod and a smile, gathering the last of her dignity around herself like armor. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets and traffic lights, her mind replaying the afternoon's events in vivid detail. Each replay made Ashley's words sting afresh, but it also crystallized something that had been building in her subconscious for months, a growing sense that she was being slowly erased from her own family's story. When had she become someone to be managed rather than included? When had her decades of experience and wisdom become irrelevant rather than valuable? When had she transformed from beloved family member to obligatory guest, someone whose presence was tolerated but not truly welcomed? Her house felt especially quiet when she entered, the silence emphasizing her solitude in a way that seemed more pronounced after the chaos of the party. She moved through the familiar rooms, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening, watering plants that weren't thirsty, seeking purpose in small tasks that felt increasingly meaningless. In the living room, Robert's photograph smiled at her from the mantelpiece. Taken on their last anniversary, just 3 months before his sudden heart attack, it captured him in a moment of pure joy, eyes crinkled with laughter, hand extended toward the camera as if he were reaching for her. She'd looked at this photo hundreds of times in the past 2 years, but tonight it seemed to be asking her a question. What would Robert think of how she'd allowed herself to fade into the background? He'd fallen in love with a woman who commanded her classroom with gentle authority, who volunteered for every committee, who never hesitated to speak up when something mattered. Where was that woman now? She picked up the frame, running her thumb along its silver edge. I let her dismiss me, Robert. I stood there and let her make me feel small and irrelevant, and I said nothing. The house seemed to absorb her words, offering no response except the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Robert's grandfather's clock, actually. One of the few pieces they'd brought with them when they'd moved to this smaller house after his retirement. But as she sat there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a life well lived, something began to shift in her chest. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but alongside it grew something else, a spark of the woman she used to be, the woman Robert had loved, the woman who had never backed down from a challenge when it truly mattered. Old people don't belong at parties. The words echoed again, but this time they didn't just wound, they ignited. Ashley wanted to define her by her age, to dismiss her based on assumptions about irrelevance and obsolescence. But what if she was wrong? What if there was another way to respond, one that didn't involve shrinking or apologizing or accepting dismissal as deserved? Stella set Robert's photograph back on the mantel, but not before pressing a kiss to her fingertips and touching it to the glass over his smiling face. What would you say about throwing a party, my love? A real celebration, the kind we always talked about but never got around to. Your 70th birthday is coming up next month, and we never did get to celebrate it properly. The idea began to take shape as she spoke aloud to the empty room, her voice growing stronger with each word. Robert's birthday, July 15th, would have been his 70th. They'd made tentative plans, nothing elaborate, just a small gathering of friends and family. But then he was gone, and the date had passed unmarked except for her private vigil at his grave. But what if she changed that? What if, instead of accepting Ashley's dismissal, she created something beautiful and meaningful, something that demonstrated exactly what old people were capable of when they set their minds to it? The more she considered the idea, the more it appealed to her, not as revenge exactly, but as reclamation, a statement about dignity and worth and the value of a life well lived. A celebration of Robert's memory that would also be a declaration of her own continued relevance. She moved to the desk where Robert used to pay bills and began pulling out paper, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she started to plan. Guest lists, venue considerations, catering options, the familiar process of organization that had served her through decades of classroom events and family gatherings. As she worked, the quiet house seemed less empty, filled instead with purpose and possibility. Ashley thought old people didn't belong at parties? Well, perhaps it was time to show her exactly what kind of party an old person could throw. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as Stela finished her initial planning session, pages of notes spread across the desk in neat categories. Tomorrow, she would begin making phone calls, reaching out to the community she'd served for so many years, tapping into networks built over decades of teaching and volunteering and simply being present in people's lives. She looked once more at Robert's photograph, and in the lamplight, she could almost imagine his smile growing wider, approving of her decision, encouraging her forward into whatever came next. This one's for both of us, my love, she whispered, and began planning the celebration of a lifetime. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's hillside cemetery, its rays catching the dew that clung to weathered headstones like tears that refused to fall. Stella had driven here without conscious decision, her Honda Civic seeming to navigate the familiar route of its own accord, while her mind wrestled with the events of the previous day. Sleep had been elusive, filled with fragments of dreams where Ashley's words echoed in endless loops, each repetition stripping away another layer of her carefully maintained composure. Robert's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, positioned to overlook the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like prayer flags against the morning sky. She'd chosen this spot because he'd always loved the view, spending countless evenings on their back porch watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with his full name, dates, and the words, "Beloved husband and father," though she sometimes thought it should have included, "Teacher of life's small joys," or "Master of Sunday morning pancakes." Settling onto the small folding chair she kept in her trunk for these visits, Stella arranged the fresh daisies she'd brought. Robert's favorites, cheerful and unpretentious, much like the man himself. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them in the built-in vase, a tremor she attributed more to emotion than age. "I made a fool of myself yesterday, my love," she began, her voice barely above a whisper in the morning stillness. "Your grandson's party, and I stood there and took it. Let that woman make me feel like some doddering old relic who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention come my way." A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves above, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the gravestone. Robert had always been an excellent listener, and death hadn't changed that quality. If anything, it had perfected it. No interruptions, no advice unless she asked for it, just the patient presence she'd grown to depend on during their 23 years of marriage. She said old people don't belong at parties. Right there in front of everyone, like I was some kind of museum piece that had wandered into the wrong exhibit. The words tasted bitter as she spoke them aloud, but there was power in voicing them, in giving shape to the hurt that had kept her awake most of the night. And you know what the worst part is? I believed her for a moment, standing there with my homemade cake that suddenly looked so pathetic next to her designer creation, wearing my best cardigan that felt frumpy and outdated. I actually wondered if she was right. If I really had become one of those elderly relatives people tolerate out of obligation rather than genuine affection. The tears came then, hot and cleansing, as if her body was finally releasing the pressure that had been building since the moment Ashley's words found their mark. She'd cried for Robert plenty in the 2 years since his death, but these tears felt different. They carried the weight of isolation, of feeling forgotten and dismissed by the very people who should value her most. "I keep thinking about what you would have said to her," Stela continued, wiping her cheeks with the tissue she always carried for these visits. "You would have found some gentle way to put her in her place without making a scene, wouldn't you? You were always so good at that, standing up for what was right without hurting anyone's feelings." Filing cabinets lined every wall, their contents organized according to a system only Eleanor understood but which had served the community flawlessly for over 30 years. Behind her massive oak desk, Eleanor herself looked like she'd been carved from the same enduring material. Silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed what appeared to be budget reports. "Stela Jones," Eleanor said without looking up from her papers. "I wondered when you'd find your way back to us." The greeting carried layers of meaning that Stella was still parsing when Eleanor finally raised her eyes, fixing both women with the kind of direct gaze that had intimidated 3 generations of Millbrook residents into better behavior. "Ma'am?" Stela found herself reverting to the respectful tone she'd used as a young teacher seeking Eleanor's guidance on community matters. "You've been hiding since Robert died," Eleanor stated matter-of-factly. "Understandable for a time, but not indefinitely. Not for someone with your particular gifts." She gestured toward the chairs facing her desk. "Sit. Tell me what's brought you out of hibernation." Rosa shot Stella an encouraging look as they settled into their seats. Eleanor Morrison had a reputation for cutting straight to the heart of matters, a quality that could be either intimidating or liberating depending on your readiness for honest conversation. "I want to throw a party," Stela began, then paused, realizing how inadequate those words were to capture the complexity of her motivations. "For Robert. His 70th birthday is next month, and we never got to celebrate it properly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying Stela with the kind of attention that made people feel simultaneously scrutinized and valued. And you need the community center, if it's available. July 15th, probably afternoon into evening. It's available. Eleanor's response was immediate, requiring no consultation with calendars or scheduling books. But that's not really why you're here, is it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stela felt Rosa's subtle encouragement, a gentle pressure of her friend's hand on her arm that reminded her she wasn't facing this alone. Yesterday, at my grandson's birthday party, my daughter-in-law told me that old people don't belong at parties. The words still stung to speak, but they carried less power now, transformed from private shame into public declaration. She said it in front of everyone, like it was just an accepted fact. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of her attention. I see. And you've decided to respond. I want to show everyone, what kind of party someone my age can put together. What we're capable of when we're not being dismissed or sidelined or treated like we're invisible. Ah! Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. Now we're getting to the real reason you're here. She rose from behind her desk and moved to the window that overlooked Main Street, where the morning routine of small-town life was unfolding. Shop owners unlocking their doors, early customers clutching coffee cups, the mail carrier beginning his familiar route. You know, I've been watching this town change for nearly 60 years, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated observation. Seen young families move in with their modern ideas about efficiency and relevance. Watched them gradually push aside the people who built this place, as if experience were a liability rather than an asset. She turned back to face Stela, her eyes bright with something that might have been mischief. Your daughter-in-law isn't the first to make that mistake, and she won't be the last. But she's chosen the wrong person to underestimate. The validation hit Stela like a wave of warm water, washing away the last residue of yesterday's humiliation. Eleanor Morrison didn't offer approval lightly. When she gave it, it came with the full weight of her considerable authority. The center is yours for the 15th. Eleanor continued. No charge. Consider it my contribution to your educational campaign. Eleanor, I can't accept. You can and you will. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. Robert Jones was a good man who served this community well. His memory deserves a proper celebration, and you deserve the chance to remind certain people about the value of wisdom and experience. As they left Eleanor's office an hour later, Stela carried not just permission to use the venue, but something more valuable. Eleanor's blessing, and, with it, access to networks of influence and support that could transform her simple party idea into something truly meaningful. But even as she spoke the words, she knew Robert would have done more than offer gentle correction. He'd possessed a quiet strength that commanded respect, an innate dignity that made people think twice before crossing lines. His presence alone would have prevented Ashley's casual cruelty, or if not prevented it, would have made it clear that such behavior was unacceptable. I've been thinking about your birthday, she said, her voice growing stronger as she moved toward the idea that had crystallized in the small hours of the morning. July 15th would have been your 70th. We had such plans, remember? Nothing elaborate, you said, just a small gathering of the people who mattered. Good food, better stories, maybe some of that wine you'd been saving for a special occasion. She reached out to trace his name on the granite, her finger following each familiar letter. What if we still had that party? What if I showed Ashley and anyone else who thinks old people don't belong at celebrations exactly what kind of party someone with 7 decades of living can put together? The idea had seemed almost vindictive when it first occurred to her at 3 a.m, lying awake in the bed that still felt too big for one person. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of Robert's final resting place, it began to transform into something larger. Not just revenge, but reclamation. A statement about worth and dignity and the accumulated wisdom that comes with age. You always said I was at my best when I had a project to focus on, she mused, remembering how he'd encouraged her involvement in school fundraisers and community events. Remember the year I organized the fall festival? Everyone said it couldn't be done with our budget, but we pulled it off, didn't we? Biggest turnout in the school's history. The memory brought a smile to her face. The first genuine one since yesterday's humiliation. She'd forgotten how good it felt to channel her energy into something meaningful. To use her organizational skills and community connections for a purpose larger than her own daily routine. Mrs. Jones? Stela, the familiar voice made her turn, and she saw Rosa Delgado approaching through the cemetery rows, moving with the careful but determined gait of someone who refused to let age dictate her limitations. Rosa's silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her bright red cardigan provided a cheerful contrast to the somber setting. "Rosa, what are you doing here so early?" "I could ask you the same thing, Mija," Rosa replied, settling onto the stone bench near Robert's grave with practiced ease. "But I know that look. That's the same expression you had when you decided to take on the school board about that new reading curriculum 3 years ago." Stela felt her cheeks flush. Rosa had moved to Millbrook 5 years ago, settling into the house next door after her own husband's death, and had quickly become the closest thing to a sister Stela had known since childhood. Their friendship had grown from neighborly pleasantries to deep companionship, built on shared experiences of loss, widowhood, and the particular challenges of maintaining dignity and purpose in a world that increasingly seemed designed for younger people. "How do you always know exactly what I'm thinking?" 30 years as a nurse teaches you to read people," Rosa said with a knowing smile. "Plus, David called me last night. He was worried about you after the party. Said you seemed upset when you left." The mention of David's concern warmed Stella's heart, even as it complicated her feelings about the previous day. Her son had noticed her distress, had cared enough to reach out to Rosa, but he hadn't intervened when Ashley made her cutting remark. The contradiction highlighted the impossible position he occupied, caught between loyalty to his mother and peace in his marriage. "Ashley told me old people don't belong at parties," Stela said simply, knowing Rosa would understand the full weight of those words. Rosa's expression darkened, her usually cheerful demeanor shifting into something more formidable. "That Niña said what now?" Despite everything, Stela found herself smiling at Rosa's protective indignation. "In front of everyone. I offered to help with the games, and she basically told me to sit down and stay out of the way because I'm too old to be useful." "Ay, Dios mío." Rosa's voice carried the particular tone of outrage that Stela had learned meant someone was about to face the full force of Rosa Delgado's opinions. "Who does she think she is? You've been throwing parties and managing children since before that girl was born." "I've been thinking about Robert's birthday," Stela said, watching Rosa's expression carefully. "What if we celebrated it this year? A real celebration, the kind we planned before." "Before he broke your heart by leaving too soon," Rosa finished gently. "It's a beautiful idea, Mija, but are you sure you're ready for that? It might be harder than you think." Stela considered the question seriously. Would it be difficult to celebrate Robert's life while still grieving his absence? Certainly. But the alternative, continuing to let his memory fade into private sorrow while accepting dismissal from people who should know better, felt worse than any emotional challenge a party might present. "I think it's exactly what I need," she said finally. "And I think it's what he would have wanted." Robert never believed in letting good intentions go to waste just because circumstances changed. Rosa studied her friend's face, reading the determination that was replacing yesterday's hurt. "What did you have in mind?" As Stela began to outline the ideas that had been percolating since her sleepless night, she felt energy returning to her voice, purpose straightening her spine. They would need a venue, somewhere large enough to accommodate the guest list she was already compiling in her mind. Food, music, decorations that reflected Robert's personality rather than some generic party aesthetic. Most importantly, they would need to reach out to the community Robert had served as a high school guidance counselor, the colleagues and friends and former students who remembered his kindness and wisdom. The community center, Rosa suggested when Stela mentioned the venue challenge. "Eleanor Morrison still runs it, doesn't she? She always liked you both." Eleanor Morrison. Stela felt a spark of excitement at the mention of the name. Eleanor was 89 years old and still commanded respect from everyone in Millbrook, from teenagers who attended her youth programs to city council members who sought her input on community issues. If anyone would understand the importance of what Stela was trying to accomplish, it would be Eleanor. "We should go see her today," Stela said, surprised by the decisiveness in her own voice. "Strike while the iron is hot, as my mother used to say." Rosa grinned, the expression transforming her face into something mischievous and conspiratorial. "Now you're talking like the Stela I know. The one who doesn't take nonsense from anyone, including uppity daughters-in-law, who need to learn some manners." They spent another hour at the cemetery, sitting beside Robert's grave as they refined their plans. Stela found herself laughing for the first time since the party, caught up in Rosa's enthusiasm and her own growing excitement about the project. As they talked, she could almost feel Robert's approval, his gentle encouragement to reclaim the confidence and purpose that grief had temporarily obscured. When they finally rose to leave, Stela placed her hand on Robert's headstone one more time. "What do you think, my love? Ready to have the birthday celebration you deserved?" The morning breeze stirred the oak leaves again, and in their whispered rustling, Stela heard what she needed to hear. Not just permission, but encouragement to step fully back into the life she'd been living on the sidelines since his death. As they walked toward their cars, Rosa linking her arm through Stella's in a gesture of solidarity, Stela felt the last of yesterday's hurt transform into tomorrow's determination. Ashley had dismissed her as irrelevant, as someone whose age disqualified her from meaningful participation in life's celebrations. She was about to discover just how wrong that assumption could be. The drive through downtown Millbrook toward Eleanor Morrison's community center took them past familiar landmarks. The library where Stela had volunteered for story time until last year, the elementary school, where she'd taught for nearly 4 decades, the small restaurants and shops where her face was recognized and her opinion valued. This was her community, built through years of service and relationship, and she was about to remind everyone, including herself, exactly what that meant. Ashley might control the narrative at family gatherings, but here in Millbrook, among the people who had known and respected Robert Jones, among the former students who still sent Christmas cards, and the colleagues who remembered his patient wisdom, Stela was about to reclaim her voice. And it was going to be magnificent. Eleanor Morrison's community center sat on the corner of Harbor and Main like a grande dame holding court, its weathered brick facade bearing witness to decades of town meetings, wedding receptions, and funeral luncheons. As Stela and Rosa climbed the front steps, the familiar scent of lemon oil and old wood greeted them, a combination that spoke of careful maintenance and stubborn dignity. They found Eleanor in her office, a room that seemed frozen in 1975 but functioned with ruthless efficiency. "Next stop, Bella Santos," Rosa announced as they walked back toward their cars. "If we're going to do this right, we need someone who understands the mechanics of a proper celebration." Isabella Santos ran Millbrook's most successful event planning business from a converted Victorian house near the harbor. Her reputation for transforming ordinary occasions into memorable experiences had made her services sought after by families throughout the coastal region, though Stela had never hired her for anything more elaborate than Robert's retirement dinner 3 years ago. They found Bella in her garden, cutting roses for what appeared to be a centerpiece arrangement. At 45, she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to manage multiple complex projects simultaneously, but her face lit up with genuine warmth when she spotted her visitors. "Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Delgado, what a lovely surprise!" Bella wiped her hands on her gardening apron and gestured toward a small seating area surrounded by flowering bushes. "Please, sit. Can I get you some iced tea?" As they settled into the comfortable wicker chairs, Stela found herself studying Bella with new eyes. She remembered a struggling single mother who had moved to Millbrook 8 years ago, desperate for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. Bella's daughter Carmen had been in Stela's 4th grade class that first year, a quiet child dealing with the emotional aftermath of her parents' separation. "I have a proposition for you," Stela began, then caught herself. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was a reconnection with someone whose life she had touched during her teaching years. "How is Carmen doing? She must be in high school now." Bella's face transformed, pride and gratitude mingling in her expression. She's a senior this year, already accepted to 3 colleges. Honor roll every semester since she started high school. She paused, her voice growing softer. I never properly thanked you for what you did that first year. The extra reading sessions, the patient way you helped her rebuild her confidence. It made all the difference. The reminder of her impact on young lives sent warmth through Stella's chest, reinforcing her sense of purpose in ways Ashley's dismissal had temporarily obscured. This was what she brought to any gathering, not just organizational skills, but genuine care for the people involved. Carmen succeeded because she's intelligent and resilient, Stela said. I just provided a little support when she needed it, which is exactly why I want to help with whatever you're planning, Bella said with characteristic directness. Rosa called this morning and gave me the broad outline, a celebration of Robert's life, and a gentle education for people who think age equals irrelevance. Over the next 2 hours, they transformed Bella's garden workspace into a planning headquarters. Lists emerged on clipboards, timelines took shape on yellow legal pads, and what had begun as Stella's personal response to humiliation evolved into something approaching a community event. Bella's professional expertise complemented Stella's intimate knowledge of Robert's preferences and Rosa's enthusiastic support. They discussed catering options that would showcase local businesses, considered entertainment that would appeal to multiple generations, and began compiling a guest list that grew with each name they added. We should reach out to his former students, Bella suggested, making notes in her distinctive handwriting. I bet there are people who would love to share stories about how he helped them navigate their high school years. And his teaching colleagues, Rosa added. Some of them are retired now, but they'd remember his impact on the school community. As the afternoon wore on, Stella felt her earlier determination crystallizing into concrete action. This wasn't just about proving Ashley wrong anymore. It was about celebrating a life that had mattered, honoring relationships that had endured, and demonstrating the kind of community connections that developed over decades of genuine service. But beneath the practical planning ran a current of anticipation that felt both exciting and slightly dangerous. She was about to step back into a more public role than she'd occupied since Robert's death, claiming space and attention in ways that might create ripple effects she couldn't predict. The thought should have been intimidating. Instead, as she watched Bella's efficient note-taking and felt Rosa's steady support, Stella realized she was looking forward to finding out exactly what those ripple effects might be. 3 days into what Rosa had started calling Operation Birthday Celebration, Stella was discovering that organizing a community event while maintaining secrecy was significantly more complex than her midnight planning session had anticipated. She'd just finished confirming the catering order with Murphy's Deli when her doorbell rang, followed immediately by the distinctive knock pattern that meant David was using his emergency key. "Mom? You home?" His voice carried from the entryway, accompanied by the sound of footsteps moving through her house with familiar confidence. Stella quickly gathered the party planning papers scattered across her kitchen table, shoving them into a manila folder just as David appeared in the doorway. His hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, a nervous habit left over from childhood, and his expression carried the particular blend of worry and frustration she recognized from his teenage years. "David, honey, what brings you by in the middle of the day?" "I was worried about you," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the boneless collapse of someone carrying too much stress. "You seemed upset when you left Jake's party, and Marcus mentioned that Mrs. Delgado called him asking about community event permits." The mention of Marcus Thompson sent a small chill through Stella's chest. David's best friend since college, Marcus worked as a family therapist and possessed the kind of observational skills that made him excellent at his job and occasionally inconvenient as an acquaintance. If Marcus was asking questions, it meant their planning activities hadn't been as discreet as she'd hoped. "Rosa's been helping me organize a small gathering," Stella said carefully, technically truthful, while omitting the scale of what they were actually planning. Nothing elaborate. David's eyes found the corner of paper peeking from beneath her manila folder, a corner that happened to contain Bella's catering timeline in her distinctive purple ink. "Mom, what's really going on? You've been different since the party. More energetic, but also more secretive." Before Stella could formulate a response that wouldn't require outright lying to her son, the doorbell rang again. This time the sound was followed by a confident knock that she didn't recognize. "Expecting someone?" David asked, already rising to answer the door with the protective instincts of a son who worried about his widowed mother. "I'll get it," Stella said quickly, but David was already moving toward the front door. She followed, her mind racing through possibilities. Rosa wasn't expected until later, and Bella had said she'd call before stopping by. Through the beveled glass panels flanking her front door, Stella could see a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing the kind of professional casual attire that suggested social services or nonprofit work. David opened the door to reveal someone who looked remarkably like Ashley, but with softer features and eyes that held warmth instead of calculated assessment. "Mrs. Jones, I'm Sophia Martinez, Ashley's sister." The woman extended her hand with a directness that reminded Stella of her own teaching days. "I was wondering if we could talk." David's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, and what might have been relief at the prospect of someone else navigating the complex family dynamics that had been weighing on him. "Of course," Stella said, stepping back to invite Sophia inside. "David, this is unexpected. Sophia, this is my son David." "We've met at family gatherings," Sophia said, with a polite nod toward David, "but I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Jones privately, if that's possible." The request hung in the air with unspoken implications. David looked between the two women, clearly torn between curiosity about this unexpected visit and awareness that his presence might complicate whatever conversation Sophia had come to initiate. "I should probably get back to work anyway," he said finally. "Mom, we'll talk later, okay?" After David left, Stela led Sophia to the living room, offering tea that was politely declined. Sophia settled onto the sofa with the kind of careful posture that suggested she'd given considerable thought to this visit, and wasn't entirely sure how it would unfold. "I heard about what happened at Jake's party," Sophia began without preamble. Ashley's comment about old people not belonging at parties. Stela felt her defenses rising, unsure whether Sophia's visit represented an attempt at family diplomacy or something more confrontational. "I see." She was wrong to say that. Sophia's words were quiet but firm. "Completely, inexcusably wrong. And I wanted you to know that not everyone in the family agrees with her attitude." The unexpected support caught Stella off guard. She'd prepared herself for months of family tension, for taking sides and choosing loyalties, but she hadn't anticipated finding an ally within Ashley's own family. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's honesty." Sophia leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. "Ashley has issues with aging. With anything that reminds her that life doesn't stay static, that people change and grow older and eventually die." The clinical way Sophia phrased her observation suggested professional training, and Stella remembered that someone had mentioned Ashley's sister worked in social services. "She wasn't always like this," Sophia continued. "When we were kids, Ashley loved our grandmother more than anyone in the world. Abuela Martinez lived with us after our grandfather died, and she was the one who made Ashley feel safe when our parents were fighting, who taught her to cook and helped her with homework." Stella found herself leaning forward despite her earlier wariness. This glimpse into Ashley's childhood was providing context she hadn't expected, complicating her growing resentment with understanding she wasn't sure she wanted. "What changed?" Sophia's expression grew painful. "Abuela developed dementia when Ashley was in high school. It was difficult. Ashley couldn't handle watching this strong, capable woman she adored gradually disappear. She stopped visiting, started avoiding family gatherings where she might have to confront the reality of what was happening." The revelation reframed Ashley's behavior in ways that made Stella's chest tighten with unwelcome empathy. Fear of aging wasn't uncommon, but for someone who'd watched a beloved grandmother fade away, it might manifest as rejection of anything that served as a reminder of mortality and decline. "She never processed that loss properly," Sophia continued. never learned to separate normal aging from disease, never developed healthy ways to cope with the fact that everyone gets older. Instead, she just decided that elderly people were problems to be managed rather than family members to be cherished. And now she sees me as a reminder of everything she's trying to avoid, Stela said, the pieces clicking into place. Exactly. Which doesn't excuse her behavior, but it might explain it. Sophia paused, studying Stella's face carefully. I also heard through some mutual friends that you're planning some kind of celebration for your late husband. A birthday party. Stella's pulse quickened. If word of the party was already spreading through informal networks, maintaining secrecy until the actual event was going to be more challenging than she'd anticipated. Small gathering, she said, using the same careful language she'd offered David. Sophia's smile suggested she wasn't fooled by the understatement. Good for you. Robert Jones was a wonderful man who deserves to be remembered and celebrated. And Ashley needs to learn that dismissing people because of their age is not only cruel, it's incredibly short-sighted. You're not worried this might cause problems within your family? Mrs. Jones, I'm a social worker. I spend my days helping families navigate difficult dynamics and learn healthier ways to communicate. Sophia's expression grew more determined. Sometimes the only way to address destructive patterns is to create situations where they can't be ignored anymore. As Sophia prepared to leave, she turned back from the front door with one final observation. For what it's worth, I think Ashley is going to be surprised by how many people care about you and your husband's memory. She's been living in a bubble where her opinions feel like universal truths. A little reality check might be exactly what she needs. After Sophia's departure, Stela sat in her living room processing the unexpected conversation. The information about Ashley's grandmother provided context that complicated her feelings about the younger woman's behavior, introducing empathy into what had been straightforward resentment. But it also reinforced her determination to proceed with the celebration. If Ashley's fear of aging was driving her to dismiss and marginalize older family members, then perhaps witnessing a vibrant celebration of an elder's life might serve as the Sophia had mentioned. The manila folder of party plans seemed to pulse with new significance as Stela retrieved it from the kitchen table. What had begun as a response to personal hurt was evolving into something larger, an opportunity to challenge assumptions, bridge generational gaps, and possibly heal family wounds that ran deeper than she'd realized. The phone rang as she was reviewing Bella's timeline, Rosa's familiar voice crackling through the speaker. Mija, we have a problem. I just ran into Ashley at the grocery store, and she was asking very pointed questions about why I was buying party supplies in bulk. Stela felt her stomach drop. What did you tell her? That I was helping with a church event, but I don't think she believed me. We might need to accelerate our timeline. As Stela hung up the phone, she realized their celebration was about to become significantly more complicated. The element of surprise was disappearing, family tensions were escalating, and she was committed to a course of action that might have consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, as she looked at Robert's photograph smiling from the mantelpiece, Stela felt a familiar surge of determination. The same feeling that had carried her through challenging parent conferences, difficult classroom situations, and every other moment in her life when backing down had been easier than standing firm. Ashley wanted to define her by her age and limitations. Sophia had offered context and support. David was caught in the middle as usual. But ultimately, this celebration was about Robert's memory and her own reclaimed dignity. Whatever complications arose, whatever family dynamics she disturbed, whatever consequences followed, she was going to throw the party of a lifetime. The question was no longer whether she could pull it off, but whether she was ready for everything that might happen when she did. The discovery came, as most devastating revelations do, through the most mundane of circumstances. Ashley was scrolling through Facebook during her lunch break, mindlessly consuming the usual mix of work updates and family photos, when she spotted a post that made her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. Looking forward to celebrating Robert Jones's 70th birthday next Saturday. Such a wonderful tribute Stela is organizing. Can't wait to share memories of an amazing man who touched so many lives. Hashtag community love, hashtag remembering Robert. The post came from Janet Morrison, a woman Ashley vaguely recognized from various town events. But it wasn't the poster that made Ashley's stomach clench. It was the 43 likes and dozen comments that had already accumulated beneath the cheerful announcement, each one expressing enthusiasm for an event Ashley knew nothing about. Robert would be so proud. Stela deserves all our support. What a beautiful way to honor his memory. I still have stories to share about how Mr. Jones helped my daughter graduate. Wouldn't miss this for the world. Ashley's thumb moved frantically across her phone screen, scrolling through comment after comment from people she recognized. Parents from Jake's school, local business owners, former colleagues from David's workplace. The scope of community engagement was staggering, suggesting an event far larger than any small gathering Stela might have mentioned to David. By the time she reached her car in the marketing firm's parking lot, Ashley had pieced together enough fragments from social media posts and comments to understand that her mother-in-law was orchestrating what appeared to be a major community celebration for her dead husband on what would have been his 70th birthday. And somehow, despite living in the same small town and sharing grandchildren with the woman, Ashley had heard nothing about it until now. The drive home passed in a blur of mounting indignation and growing dread. How had Stela managed to organize something this extensive without word reaching the immediate family? More importantly, why had she been excluded from planning what was clearly being positioned as a significant family event? But even as the questions multiplied, a small voice in the back of Ashley's mind whispered the answer she didn't want to acknowledge. The timing, coming just days after Jake's party. The deliberate secrecy. The community involvement that made this feel less like a private memorial and more like a public statement. David's car was already in the driveway when she arrived home, which meant he'd left work early, never a good sign. Through the kitchen window, she could see him sitting at their breakfast bar, shoulders hunched in the posture that indicated serious internal conflict. "We need to talk," Ashley announced as she entered the house, her voice carrying more edge than she'd intended. David looked up from the glass of whiskey he'd apparently deemed necessary for a Tuesday afternoon conversation. "I figured you'd found out by now. Small town, big event, social media. It was only a matter of time." "How long have you known?" "Suspected for a few days, confirmed about an hour ago when Marcus called." David's voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd been dreading this conversation. "Mom's been planning a birthday celebration for Robert. Apparently it's grown into something fairly substantial." Ashley felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "And you didn't think to mention this to your wife? To discuss how we should handle our 8-year-old son potentially attending an event organized by someone who's clearly trying to make some kind of point about our family dynamics?" "What point would that be, Ashley?" The question hung in the air like a lit fuse. David's voice had carried a new quality, not his usual conflict-avoidant tone, but something sharper, more challenging. Ashley realized she was approaching dangerous territory, where years of careful family navigation might unravel in a single conversation. "You know exactly what I mean." "No, I really don't. Explain to me what's problematic about my mother organizing a celebration for my stepfather's memory." Ashley moved to the kitchen counter, needing something solid beneath her hands as she formulated words that wouldn't sound as defensive as she felt. "The timing, David. This is happening less than a week after there was some tension at Jake's party." "After you told her that old people don't belong at parties," David said quietly. The directness of his statement hit Ashley like a physical blow. She'd expected him to dance around the issue, to find diplomatic ways to address the family tension without assigning blame or taking sides. Instead, he was forcing her to confront her own words with an honesty that made her stomach tighten. "I didn't mean—" "What did you mean, Ashley? Because from where I was standing, it sounded like you were dismissing my mother's relevance based on her age. In front of our son. In front of other parents. In front of people who've known and respected her for decades." The conversation was spiraling away from Ashley's control in ways that felt increasingly dangerous. She'd expected to discuss strategy, to figure out how to manage the social implications of Stella's party planning. Instead, she found herself defending words she'd spoken without consideration. Behavior she'd rationalized as necessary boundary setting. "Your mother has a way of taking over situations," she said carefully. "I was trying to maintain some control over my own son's party." David's expression shifted into something Ashley had rarely seen, disappointment mixed with what might have been disgust. By telling her she didn't belong there? Before Ashley could respond, Jake's voice echoed from the living room where he'd been presumably watching television. "Why are you and Daddy yelling about Grandma Stela?" The innocent question sent panic shooting through Ashley's chest. Jake had been unusually quiet since his birthday party, spending more time in his room and asking fewer questions about family plans. She'd attributed his subdued behavior to the normal post-celebration letdown, but now she wondered if he'd absorbed more of the adult tension than she'd realized. "We're not yelling, buddy," David called back, his voice immediately gentling. "Just having a discussion." "About the party Grandma's making for Grandpa Robert?" Ashley and David exchanged sharp glances. If Jake knew about the celebration, it meant Stela had either told him directly or the information had reached him through other channels. Neither possibility boded well for maintaining family unity or parental authority. "What do you know about a party, Jake?" Ashley asked, moving toward the living room with forced casualness. Jake looked between his parents with the careful expression children develop when they sense adult conflict, but don't understand its source. "Sophia told me when she picked me up from school yesterday. She said Grandma was planning something special to remember Grandpa Robert, and that lots of people wanted to come because he was really nice to everyone." "Sophia." Ashley felt a surge of betrayal alongside her growing anxiety. Her own sister had not only known about Stela's plans, but had apparently been discussing them with Jake, undermining any chance Ashley might have had to control the narrative or manage her son's involvement. "Did Sophia say anything else about this party?" David asked, his tone neutral but his attention focused entirely on Jake's response. "She said sometimes grown-ups forget to be nice to each other, but that doesn't mean kids have to stop loving people." Jake's 8-year-old wisdom carried the particular devastation that comes from children's ability to cut straight to the heart of adult failures. "She said Grandpa Robert would want everyone to be happy together, not sad and angry." The silence that followed Jake's observation seemed to expand until it filled every corner of their house. Ashley felt the weight of her son's innocent judgment, the recognition that her behavior at his birthday party had created confusion and pain for the person she most wanted to protect. David was the first to break the silence. "Jake, why don't you go play in your room for a few minutes? Your mom and I need to finish our conversation." Once Jake's footsteps faded up the stairs, David turned to Ashley with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something more final, more decisive. "I'm going to the party," he said simply. "I'm taking Jake, and probably Emma too if she's interested. My mother is celebrating the memory of a man who was important to our family, and we're going to be there to support her. David, we need to discuss. What we need to discuss is why you thought it was appropriate to publicly dismiss my mother at our son's birthday party, and why you seem more concerned about controlling family narratives than supporting family relationships." The words hit Ashley with the force of accumulated resentments finally finding voice. She realized that David's usual conflict avoidance hadn't meant acceptance of her perspective. It had meant careful containment of his own growing frustrations. "I'm not trying to control anything," she said weakly, knowing even as she spoke that the words sounded false. "Then you won't object to attending Robert's celebration and showing our support for Mom's efforts to honor his memory." The challenge was clear, and Ashley found herself facing a choice that felt impossible from every angle. Attend the party and appear to endorse what felt like public judgment of her behavior, or refuse to attend and confirm every negative assumption people might make about her character and family values. As she stood in her perfect kitchen, surrounded by the carefully curated life she'd built to demonstrate her success and control, Ashley realized that Stela's response to a moment of casual cruelty had evolved into something far more significant than family drama. Her mother-in-law had created a test that Ashley couldn't avoid and wasn't sure she could pass. David stood on his mother's front porch for nearly 5 minutes before finally raising his hand to knock. The familiar blue paint was beginning to peel around the doorframe, something Robert would have noticed and fixed immediately, but which had gone unaddressed for the 2 years since his death. These small signs of his mother's solitary life always hit David harder than he expected. Reminders of how much had changed since the steady presence of his stepfather had anchored their family dynamics. The door opened before his knuckles made contact, revealing Stella in her gardening clothes, soil still clinging to her hands, and an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to wariness. "David, I wasn't expecting you." "I know." He studied her face, noting the subtle changes that had emerged over the past week, a brightness in her eyes that had been absent since Robert's death, but also a tension around her mouth that suggested she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside to let him enter, and he followed her to the kitchen where she washed her hands at the sink with methodical care. The room felt different somehow, more alive than it had during his recent visits. Recipe cards were scattered across the counter alongside what appeared to be guest list revisions, and the calendar on the refrigerator bore new notations in his mother's careful handwriting. "You look busy," he observed, settling into the chair that had been his designated spot since childhood. "The garden needs attention this time of year," she replied, deliberately misunderstanding his meaning as she dried her hands on a dish towel that had seen better decades. "Mom." His voice carried the patience of someone who'd spent years navigating his mother's tendency toward deflection when uncomfortable topics arose. "We both know I'm not here to discuss your tomatoes." Stella's shoulders straightened slightly, and David recognized the subtle shift in posture that had preceded every difficult conversation throughout his childhood. The moment when his mother transformed from nurturing caregiver to the quietly formidable woman who'd raised him as a single parent while building a respected career in education. "If you're here to ask me to cancel Robert's celebration, the answer is no." Her directness surprised him. He'd expected the careful diplomatic approach she usually employed when family tensions arose, not this clear line drawn in the sand before he'd even stated his position. "I'm not here to ask you to cancel anything," David said carefully. "I'm here because my wife discovered the party through Facebook. Because my 8-year-old son knows more about what's happening in our family than I do. And because Marcus Thompson called me at work to ask if I knew my mother was organizing what sounds like a major community event." "Marcus called you?" Stella's surprise seemed genuine, and David caught a flicker of something that might have been vulnerability beneath her defensive posture. He was concerned. Said Rosa had been asking about permits and liability insurance, that Eleanor Morrison was personally handling the community center booking, and that Bella Santos was apparently coordinating catering for over 100 people. David leaned forward in his chair. "Mom, what exactly are you planning?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. David could see his mother calculating her response, weighing honesty against the protective instincts that had shaped their relationship since his father's abandonment when he was 7 years old. "I'm planning a birthday celebration for my husband," Stella said finally. "The celebration we never got to have because he died before I could organize it properly." "And the community involvement? The social media posts? The fact that Ashley found out about a family event through Janet Morrison's Facebook page?" Stella's composure flickered, and David caught a glimpse of the hurt that had been driving her actions. Perhaps Ashley should have been more concerned about family communication before she decided to announce her views on my relevance at your son's birthday party. There it was, the core issue neither of them had wanted to address directly. David felt the familiar weight of being caught between two women he loved, each nursing grievances against the other that seemed to grow more entrenched with every passing day. "She was wrong to say that," David said quietly. "Completely wrong, and I should have spoken up immediately." The admission seemed to surprise Stella more than his earlier directness had. She sank into the chair across from him, some of the defensive tension leaving her shoulders. "But?" she prompted, clearly expecting qualifications to follow his support. "But this party, Mom, it feels like retaliation. Like you're trying to prove something by organizing this elaborate celebration and making sure Ashley knows she's not involved in the planning." Stella's eyes flashed with something sharper than hurt. "And what if I am trying to prove something?" What if I'm tired of being treated like I'm invisible, like my opinions don't matter, like my presence is something to be tolerated rather than valued? The pain in her voice hit David like a physical blow. He'd known Ashley's comment had hurt his mother, but he'd underestimated the depth of that wound and the way it had connected to larger feelings of isolation and diminished relevance she'd been carrying since Robert's death. "Mom, you're not invisible. You matter to me, to Jake, to this whole community." "Do I?" Stela's interruption was sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like I've become someone you visit out of obligation. Someone Ashley manages like a problem to be solved. Someone who's expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention come my way." The accusation stung because it carried enough truth to make David uncomfortable. How often had his visits become perfunctory check-ins? How many times had he deferred to Ashley's preferences about family gatherings, holiday traditions, the children's schedules? When had he stopped seeing his mother as a person with her own needs and desires, and started treating her as a responsibility to be managed? "That's not how I see you," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "Then why didn't you defend me when Ashley dismissed me in front of everyone at Jake's party?" The question he'd been dreading, delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that demanded complete honesty. David felt the weight of his own cowardice, his tendency to avoid conflict even when silence meant allowing someone he loved to be hurt. "Because I'm a coward," he said finally. "Because I've spent so many years trying to keep peace between you and Ashley, that I've forgotten how to stand up for what's right when it might create conflict." Stela blinked, clearly not expecting such stark self-assessment. "David." "No, let me finish." He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in the gesture she'd recognized since his teenage years. "I love you both, and I've been so focused on managing that love, on preventing arguments and maintaining some kind of balance, that I've failed both of you. I failed you by not speaking up when Ashley was cruel, and I failed Ashley by not helping her understand how important you are to our family." The silence that followed his confession felt different from the defensive tension that had characterized their conversation thus far. Stela studied his face with the careful attention she'd once given to struggling students, looking for signs of genuine understanding beneath his words. "I don't want to cause problems in your marriage," she said eventually. "Mom, my marriage is my responsibility to figure out. Just like this party is your decision to make." David met her eyes directly. "But I need you to be honest with me about what you're really trying to accomplish." Before Stela could respond, they heard the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway, followed by footsteps on the front porch that moved with purposeful determination, rather than casual visit energy. David and Stela exchanged glances, both recognizing the particular rhythm of Ashley's approach. "Were you expecting her?" Stela asked. "No, but I'm not surprised she's here." The front door opened without a knock. Ashley had never fully embraced the courtesy of waiting for invitation when family tensions were running high. Her voice carried through the house with the clipped precision that indicated carefully controlled anger. "David? I know you're here. Your car's in the driveway." "Kitchen?" David called back, his voice resigned. Ashley appeared in the doorway, wearing the professional armor she donned for difficult conversations. Perfectly styled hair, carefully applied makeup, clothing that projected competence and control. But David could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she was less composed than her appearance indicated. "Stela." Ashley's acknowledgement was coolly polite. "I think we need to discuss this party situation." Quote, "There's nothing to discuss," Stela replied, her own voice taking on the formal tone she used with difficult parents during her teaching years. "I'm organizing a celebration for my deceased husband. The arrangements are well in hand." "The arrangements that involve half the town but somehow excluded your son's family?" David watched the two women square off across his childhood kitchen, each representing different aspects of his life that had never quite managed to integrate smoothly. Ashley's accusation carried legitimate hurt. She had been excluded from planning what was clearly being positioned as a significant family event. But Stela's defensive response reflected her own deep wound, the casual dismissal that had catalyzed this entire situation. Perhaps you should have considered family inclusion before you decided I was too old to participate meaningfully in family celebrations, Stela replied, her quiet dignity making Ashley's accusation sound petulant by comparison. I never said you were too old. You said old people don't belong at parties. Stela's interruption was precise, each word delivered with the clarity of someone who had replayed the moment countless times. In front of other parents, in front of your children, you declared that my age disqualified me from participating in my own grandson's celebration. Ashley's composure flickered, and David saw the moment when his wife realized she was fighting a battle she'd already lost through her own careless cruelty. I was trying to manage the party logistics. You were putting me in my place, Stela said simply. And now you're upset because I've decided not to stay there. The truth of the statement hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering unnoticed for months. David realized that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Ashley made her dismissive comment, that his mother's party planning was just the vehicle for a reckoning that needed to happen regardless of the specific catalyst. I don't want this to divide our family, Ashley said, her voice smaller than usual. Neither do I, Stela replied, but I'm no longer willing to preserve family unity by accepting dismissal and disrespect. David looked between the two women who had shaped his adult life in different but equally important ways. His mother, who had sacrificed her own needs countless times to raise him well and build a stable home after his father's abandonment. His wife, who had worked hard to create the kind of family stability she'd never experienced as a child, but who seemed threatened by any challenge to her carefully constructed control. Then we figure out how to move forward, he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. All of us. Together. Because Jake is watching how we handle this, and Emma will be watching soon enough, and I refuse to teach my children that family conflict is resolved by exclusion and resentment. Both women turned to look at him, and David realized that for perhaps the first time in years, he was taking a clear position instead of trying to navigate between competing demands for his loyalty. The party happens, he continued. We all attend, we all participate, and afterward, we figure out how to build better relationships based on mutual respect, instead of managing each other's feelings. Ashley's face went through several expressions before settling on something that might have been reluctant acceptance. Stela nodded slowly, recognition dawning that her son was finally stepping into the adult authority she'd been waiting years for him to claim. And if I'm not ready for that? Ashley asked quietly. Then you'll have to decide what's more important, David replied. Being right, or being family? The morning of Robert's celebration dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that coastal Maine reserved for its most perfect summer days. Stela stood at her kitchen window, watching the harbor come alive with the first fishing boats of the day, and felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that reminded her of her first day teaching 37 years ago. The same flutter in her stomach, the same questions about whether she was truly prepared for what lay ahead. By 8 a.m. her phone had buzzed with 17 text messages, 12 voicemails, and enough missed calls to make her wonder if some emergency had occurred overnight. But as she scrolled through the notifications, she realized they weren't harbingers of crisis. They were confirmations, last-minute offers of help, and expressions of excitement that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Stela, it's Margaret from the library. I found those photos of Robert from the literacy fundraiser in 2018. Should I bring them to the center? Mrs. Jones, this is Tommy Castellano. You probably remember me from your 4th grade class 20 years ago. I heard about Mr. Jones's celebration and wanted to share a story about how he helped me choose my college major. See you this afternoon. Mija, it's Rosa. I'm at the flower market and they have the most beautiful sunflowers. Robert's favorites, yes. I'm buying all of them. Don't argue with me about the cost. Each message reinforced what had been building throughout the week of preparation. This celebration had touched something deeper in the Millbrook community than she'd anticipated. What she'd conceived as a response to personal hurt had evolved into something larger, a collective desire to honor a life that had mattered, to celebrate the kind of quiet service that often went unrecognized until it was gone. Eleanor Morrison arrived at 9:30 sharp, driving her ancient but impeccably maintained Cadillac, with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been navigating Millbrook streets since before most current residents were born. She emerged from the car wearing what Stela recognized as her important occasions outfit, a navy dress that had probably cost more than most people's monthly salary when it was purchased sometime in the 1990s, accessorized with pearl earrings and an expression of satisfied determination. "Good morning, Stella," Eleanor announced, already surveying the community center parking lot with the critical eye of someone accustomed to managing large-scale events. "I trust you're ready for what you've set in motion?" The question carried layers of meaning that made Stella pause in her unlocking of the center's main doors. "I'm not sure anyone could be ready for what this has become." Eleanor's smile was sharp with approval. "The best celebrations are the ones that take on lives of their own." Robert would be pleased to know his memory has inspired such community response. They spent the next hour transforming the center's main hall into something that balanced elegance with warmth. Bella arrived with 2 assistants and a van full of flowers that included Rosa's sunflowers, alongside arrangements that somehow managed to look both professional and personal. The round tables Eleanor had suggested were draped with ivory linens and centered with photographs of Robert that had been collected from dozens of sources throughout the week. Robert at school events, community fundraisers, quiet moments with family, professional headshots from his guidance counselor days, candid shots that captured his easy smile and genuine warmth. "Mrs. Jones," a young man appeared at Stella's elbow, carrying a large framed photograph she didn't recognize. He looked familiar in the way that former students often did, grown beyond her memory, but retaining something essential that connected to a child she'd once taught. "I'm Michael Santos, Bella's nephew. I think you taught my cousin Carmen?" "Of course. Carmen is Bella's daughter. She's in college now, isn't she?" Michael's face lit up with the particular pleasure people feel when remembered by teachers who mattered to them. "She is, and doing great. But I actually knew Mr. Jones through the high school guidance program. He helped me figure out my path when I was pretty lost as a teenager." He held up the photograph, Robert, at what appeared to be a high school graduation ceremony, surrounded by students in caps and gowns, his expression radiating the quiet pride of someone who'd played a part in their success. "I thought this might belong here today," Michael continued. "It was taken at my graduation 5 years ago." Mr. Jones attended even though he'd already retired, because he said he wanted to see how the story ended for kids he'd helped along the way. Stella felt her throat tighten as she accepted the photograph. This was Robert exactly. The man who remembered birthdays years after students graduated, who showed up to weddings and celebrations because he understood that guidance counselors were often the adults who'd believed in kids when they couldn't believe in themselves. "It's perfect," she managed. "Thank you for bringing it." By noon, the center had been transformed into something that felt both celebratory and intimate. Bella had somehow managed to create an atmosphere that honored Robert's memory while maintaining the warmth of a family gathering. The catering tables offered a mix of Robert's favorite foods, alongside contributions from community members who'd insisted on bringing something personal to share. "This is beautiful, Stella." Dr. Jim Walsh's voice carried genuine admiration as he surveyed the transformed space. He'd arrived early to help with final setup, his presence providing a steadying influence that Stella was grateful for, even as she remained uncertain about the nature of their developing friendship. "I keep feeling like I should be more nervous," she confided, adjusting a flower arrangement that didn't need adjusting. "Like I'm missing some crucial detail that will make everything fall apart." Jim's expression grew gentle. "You know, in my 40 years of practicing medicine, I learned that the procedures I worried about most were usually the ones that went smoothest. Anxiety often means we care deeply about the outcome, and caring deeply generally leads to thorough preparation." His words carried the weight of professional experience, but also something more personal, the understanding of someone who'd navigated his own share of significant life transitions. Stela found herself studying his face, noting the kindness in his eyes and wondering when his presence had become something she looked forward to, rather than simply appreciated. "Dr. Walsh." "Jim, I want you to know how much your help this week has meant. I couldn't have managed all this alone." "You weren't alone," he replied simply. "That's been the most remarkable thing to witness. How many people wanted to be part of celebrating Robert's life? You didn't organize this event so much as you created space for it to happen." By 2 o'clock, guests were beginning to arrive in a steady stream that filled the parking lot with cars and the hall with voices that carried decades of shared history. Stela positioned herself near the entrance, greeting people with the kind of gracious attention she'd perfected during her teaching years, but she found herself scanning each arrival for signs of her own family. David had confirmed their attendance during their difficult kitchen conversation 3 days ago, but Ashley's participation remained an open question. Would they come together as a family unit, presenting unified support despite private tensions? Would David arrive with the children while Ashley stayed home, creating the kind of obvious absence that would fuel speculation? Would they skip the event entirely, prioritizing family peace over community expectations? "Mrs. Jones!" Jake's voice carried across the parking lot as he broke away from David and Ashley's approach, running toward her with the unguarded enthusiasm that made her heart swell despite the complicated circumstances of their arrival. "Happy birthday, Grandpa Robert," he announced as he reached her, his 8-year-old logic having processed the celebration in the most straightforward terms possible. "I brought a picture I drew of him in heaven with all the dogs he always said he missed." Stela knelt to accept his artwork. A crayon drawing that showed a stick figure man surrounded by what appeared to be several dozen colorful dogs of various sizes. The innocent sweetness of his gesture made her eyes water as she hugged him close. "He would love this, sweetheart. We'll put it right up front where everyone can see it." David approached with Emma balanced on his hip, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes carrying warmth that suggested genuine support rather than mere obligation. Ashley followed a few steps behind, her posture rigid with the kind of tension that indicated she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mom." David's greeting was accompanied by a brief but firm hug. "The place looks incredible. Robert would be amazed by all this." Ashley's acknowledgement was more reserved, a polite nod and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's very nice, Stella. You've obviously put a lot of work into this." The careful neutrality of her words carried the weight of their unresolved conflict, but also something else. Perhaps recognition that she was surrounded by a community that clearly held Stela in deep regard. Whatever private resentments Ashley might harbor, they were being temporarily set aside in deference to public expectations of family unity. "Thank you for coming," Stela replied, meaning it despite the lingering tension. "It means everything to have you here." As her family settled at their designated table near the front of the room, Stela felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. They'd navigated the first hurdle, attendance, but the real test would come as the afternoon unfolded, as community members shared stories and memories that would either bridge the gaps in their family relationships or highlight them more starkly. Rosa appeared at her elbow, resplendent in a bright purple dress that somehow managed to look both festive and dignified. "Meja, you need to see who just arrived." Stela followed Rosa's gaze toward the entrance, where a steady stream of familiar faces was creating something approaching a receiving line. Former teaching colleagues, parents of students from years past, neighbors who'd shared countless conversations over back fences, members of the church where she and Robert had been married. The breadth of community representation was overwhelming in its scope and obvious affection. But it was the small group near the back of the line that made Stela's breath catch. 3 middle-aged adults she recognized as former students from her earliest teaching years, accompanied by teenagers who could only be their children, all dressed in the kind of careful Sunday best that indicated they'd approached this event as something significant and worthy of respect. Mrs. Jones. The woman at the front of the group stepped forward with a smile that transformed her face into an echo of the shy 7-year-old Stela suddenly remembered. "I'm Patricia Williams. I was Patricia Martinez in your 3rd grade class 30 years ago. These are my kids, and they wanted to meet the teacher their mom still talks about." The connection between past and present, between the work she'd done and its lasting impact, hit Stela with unexpected force. This was what Robert had always understood about teaching, that the relationships built in classrooms extended far beyond academic years, creating bonds that influence generations. Patricia, of course! You were the one who wrote those beautiful stories about your grandmother's garden. You remember that? Patricia's face lit up with the particular joy people feel when their childhood selves are recalled with specificity and warmth. I became a writer, actually. Children's books. And I always tell people it started with a teacher who saw something in my stories that I didn't even know was there. As the afternoon progressed and similar conversations multiplied throughout the hall, Stella began to understand that this celebration had become something far larger than she'd imagined. It wasn't just about Robert's memory, though that remained central. It wasn't just about responding to Ashley's dismissive comment, though that had provided the catalyst. It had become a recognition of lives well lived, of service that mattered, of the connections between generations that too often went unacknowledged, until occasions like this forced them into the light. Looking across the crowded room at her family's table, where Jake was showing his picture to anyone who would listen, and Ashley was engaged in what appeared to be genuine conversation with one of Robert's former colleagues, Stella felt something shift inside her chest. The hurt that had driven her initial planning was still there, but it had been transformed by the afternoon's events into something more complex and hopeful. Perhaps this was what healing looked like, not the absence of pain, but its integration into something larger and more meaningful. Robert's memory was being honored exactly as he would have wanted, surrounded by community, and marked by the kind of authentic connection that had defined his approach to both professional service and personal relationships. The celebration was far from over, but already Stella could see that whatever happened next, with Ashley, with David, with the complicated dynamics of their family, something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the dismissed elder tolerating disrespect for the sake of family peace. She was Stela Jones, beloved teacher, devoted wife, valued community member. And that identity, reinforced by the voices and faces surrounding her this afternoon, was strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The afternoon had settled into the comfortable rhythm of shared stories and gentle laughter, when a ripple of awareness moved through the community center, like wind across water. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the entrance, and Stella felt that particular shift in atmosphere that occurs when something unexpected is about to unfold. Sofia Martinez stood in the doorway, her hand firmly clasped around Jake's smaller one, both of them slightly breathless as if they'd hurried to arrive. Jake wore his best button-down shirt, the one Ashley usually reserved for church and school photos, and carried a small wrapped package that he clutched with the careful attention 8-year-olds reserve for truly important missions. "I'm sorry we're late, Mrs. Jones," Sophia called across the room, her voice carrying the kind of determination that suggested she'd made a deliberate choice to be here despite potential consequences. "Someone insisted we needed to stop for a proper gift." Jake broke away from Sophia's grasp and made his way through the gathered crowd with single-minded purpose, his small face serious with the weight of whatever mission he'd assigned himself. The conversations around him quieted, as adults recognized the particular intensity children bring to moments they've decided matter deeply. "Grandma Stella," Jake announced when he reached her, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I brought something for Grandpa Robert's birthday." Sophia helped me pick it out, but it was my idea. Stella knelt to Jake's eye level, aware that every person in the room was witnessing this exchange but focused entirely on her grandson's earnest expression. "What did you bring, sweetheart?" Jake held out the wrapped package with ceremonial care. "It's a picture frame." Sophia said people put pictures of people they love in frames so they can look at them whenever they want to remember happy things. The gift was small and clearly inexpensive, the kind of simple wooden frame sold at drugstores and discount retailers. But as Stella unwrapped it, she found that Jake had already installed a photograph. A candid shot from last Christmas showing Robert teaching Jake to play chess, both of them bent over the board in concentration. Robert's patient smile captured in profile as he guided Jake's small hand toward a piece. "I asked Daddy to print it from his phone," Jake explained, his words tumbling together with excitement. "It's from when Grandpa Robert was teaching me about the horse pieces and how they jump over other pieces in that funny way. Remember?" You took the picture because you said we looked like we were solving the world's biggest puzzle. Stella did remember, one of those ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. Robert's infinite patience with children's questions, his gentle way of turning every interaction into a learning opportunity, the genuine joy he'd taken in Jake's eager participation in adult activities. It's perfect, Jake. Absolutely perfect. She hugged him close, breathing in his familiar scent of bubblegum and playground dust, grateful for his pure-hearted gesture in ways that transcended words. Can we put it with the other pictures of Grandpa Robert, so everyone can see how good he was at teaching kids stuff? Of course we can. As Stella rose to place Jake's gift among the other photographs displayed around the room, she became aware that the quiet attention focused on their exchange had shifted. Near the entrance, David stood frozen in apparent shock, his face cycling through expressions that suggested he was processing the implications of his son's unauthorized attendance. Behind David, Ashley's arrival created the kind of atmospheric disturbance that occurs when someone enters a space where their presence is both expected and dreaded. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Stella could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she was operating on the edge of her comfort zone. "Jake?" David's voice carried across the room with parental authority mixed with confusion. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air as Jake looked between his father and grandmother, clearly processing the adult complications he'd stumbled into by following his 8-year-old logic about doing the right thing. "Sophia said Grandpa Robert would want us to be here," Jake replied with the straightforward honesty that made adult evasions impossible. "She said sometimes grown-ups get confused about what's important, but kids usually know the right thing to do." Ashley moved through the crowd with the careful precision of someone navigating hostile territory, her heels clicking against the community center's hardwood floors, in a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud against the room's expectant silence. "Jake, you can't just leave the house without permission," she said when she reached them, her voice carrying the strained patience of someone trying to maintain parental authority in front of an audience. "We've talked about this, but I asked Sophia, and she said it was okay." Jake protested, his confusion evident as he tried to understand why his logical solution was being questioned. "She's grown up, and she said Grandpa Robert would be sad if we didn't come to his party." Sophia stepped forward, her expression showing none of the defensive tension Ashley displayed. "I take full responsibility for bringing him. Jake called me this afternoon, very upset, because he'd overheard you and David arguing about whether to attend. He asked if I thought Grandpa Robert would understand why his family wasn't at his birthday party." The words landed with devastating precision, highlighting the disconnect between adult conflict and childhood wisdom. Around them, the community members who'd gathered to celebrate Robert's memory were witnessing a family drama that threw into sharp relief the very values Robert had embodied. The importance of showing up for people you love, of choosing connection over convenience, of recognizing what truly matters in life. "Ashley." Eleanor Morrison's voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation after the celebration. Robert would want his birthday to be remembered for joy, not family discord." The gentle but firm redirection carried the weight of community expectation, and Stela watched Ashley's face as she processed the social dynamics at play. Every person in the room was watching, judging, forming opinions about character and values based on how she chose to respond to this moment. David moved closer to his family, his expression suggesting he was still processing the implications of Jake's independent action and Sophia's support of it. "Mom, I'm sorry about this. We had planned to come as a family, but there were some last-minute complications." "No complications," Jake announced, with the clarity that only children can bring to adult euphemisms. "You and Mommy were fighting about whether Grandpa Robert's party was more important than being mad at Grandma Stela. I decided it was more important, so I called Sophia." The brutal honesty of Jake's summary created a moment of silence that felt both awkward and clarifying. Here was the situation stripped of diplomatic language and adult rationalizations. A family choosing conflict over celebration, anger over love, pride over connection. Ashley's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "Jake, you can't just..." We can't just. She looked around the room full of expectant faces, all waiting to see how she would navigate this public revelation of private family dysfunction. Mrs. Martinez Jones. A voice spoke from the crowd, and Stella recognized Patricia Williams, the former student who'd become a children's book author. I don't know if you remember me, but I was in Mrs. Jones's third-grade class 30 years ago. Ashley nodded politely, clearly uncertain where this intervention was heading. I wanted to tell you something about your son, Patricia continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose in working with children. When I was Jake's age, I was terrified of making mistakes, of disappointing the adults in my life. Mrs. Jones taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is follow your heart, even when grown-ups are too confused by their own problems to see clearly. She paused, looking directly at Jake with obvious admiration. Your son just demonstrated wisdom that most adults struggle with, the understanding that love and respect for family should triumph over pride and hurt feelings. You should be incredibly proud of him. The words hit Ashley with visible impact. Stella could see her daughter-in-law processing the implications, that Jake's action was being praised rather than criticized, that his choice to attend the celebration was being framed as moral courage rather than disobedience. I am proud of him, Ashley said quietly, her voice carrying a quality Stella hadn't heard before, vulnerability mixed with recognition. I'm proud, and I'm ashamed that it took an 8-year-old to remind us what's really important. The admission created a shift in the room's atmosphere, transforming tension into possibility. David moved closer to Ashley, his hand finding hers in a gesture of support that suggested they might be finding their way toward unity, rather than continued conflict. Grandpa Robert always said the best parties are the ones where everyone comes together, Jake announced, apparently satisfied that the adult confusion was resolving itself in favor of what he'd known was right all along. Can we have cake now? Sophia said there would be really good cake. The innocent question broke the remaining tension, transforming the moment from family drama into celebration. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of gentle amusement that comes from recognizing universal truths through children's eyes. Yes, sweetheart, Stela said, ruffling Jake's hair with affection that encompassed not just her love for him but gratitude for his pure-hearted intervention in their complicated adult world. Let's have cake. Let's celebrate properly. As the crowd began moving toward the dessert table, Ashley remained still for a moment, her eyes meeting Stella's across the space that had separated them for so long. In that look, Stella saw recognition, not just of Jake's wisdom, but of the damage that pride and fear had inflicted on their family relationships. Stela, Ashley said, her voice barely audible above the conversations resuming around them. Could we talk? After the celebration? Of course, Stela replied, and for the first time since Jake's birthday party, she felt genuine hope that healing might be possible. But first, there was cake to serve, stories to share, and Robert's memory to honor properly, surrounded by family, chosen and given, united in recognition of what truly matters when all the complications fall away. The afternoon light filtered through the community center's tall windows, casting golden rectangles across tables, where conversations had settled into the comfortable rhythm of shared memories. Ashley found herself seated between David's former colleague Marcus and Mrs. Patterson, a retired librarian who seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of every family in Millbrook dating back 3 generations. Your mother-in-law was instrumental in getting our literacy program off the ground, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice carrying the warm appreciation of someone describing a cherished collaborator. This was back in the early 2000s, when budget cuts had eliminated most of the reading specialists. Stella organized volunteer tutoring sessions that ran every Saturday morning for nearly 5 years. Ashley nodded politely but found herself genuinely listening, rather than simply waiting for the conversation to move to safer topics. Since Jake's dramatic entrance had forced her attendance, she'd been drawn into story after story about Stella's community involvement, each anecdote revealing layers of service and connection Ashley had never known existed. She never mentioned that, Ashley said, glancing toward the front of the room where Stella was helping Jake arrange his chess photograph among the other memorial displays. Oh, Stella never talks about her volunteer work. Marcus interjected with the knowing smile of someone who'd observed the Jones family dynamics for years. She's constitutionally incapable of self-promotion. Robert used to joke that he had to read about his wife's accomplishments in the local newspaper because she'd never think to mention them at home. The comment struck Ashley with unexpected force. How many times had David mentioned his mother's activities only to have Ashley dismiss them as busy work or ways to fill time? How often had she assumed that Stela's involvement in community organizations was the hobbyist dabbling of someone with too much time on her hands, rather than the meaningful service of someone contributing skills and experience to necessary work? She helped my daughter through some very difficult times, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing softer with memory. Samantha was struggling with reading in 3rd grade, and the school was talking about holding her back. Stela worked with her every Saturday for an entire school year, never missing a session, never making Samantha feel stupid or slow. Where is Samantha now? Ashley found herself asking, genuinely curious despite her earlier desire to escape these testimonials. She just finished her master's degree in education, Mrs. Patterson replied with obvious pride. She teaches 2nd grade in Portland now, and she still sends Stela a card every year on the anniversary of the day she read her first complete chapter book. As the afternoon progressed, Ashley accumulated similar stories from dozens of sources. Parents whose children had been helped, community members whose projects had benefited from Stela's organizational skills, neighbors who'd been supported through difficult times with quiet, practical assistance that never announced itself as charity. Mrs. Martinez Jones? A young woman approached their table, carrying a sleeping toddler and looking uncertain about interrupting their conversation. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you're Ashley, David's wife?" Ashley nodded, prepared for another round of testimonials about her mother-in-law's virtues. "I'm Carmen Santos, Bella's daughter. Mrs. Jones was my 4th grade teacher." Carmen's face lit up with the particular warmth people reserve for teachers who'd made lasting impact. "I wanted to thank you for coming today. I know family situations can be complicated, but it means a lot to see everyone here supporting Mrs. Jones." The comment carried subtle but unmistakable knowledge of the family tensions that had preceded this event. Ashley realized that her conflicts with Stela hadn't existed in a vacuum. In a small town like Millbrook, family dynamics became community knowledge, and her treatment of her mother-in-law had likely been observed and discussed in ways she'd never considered. "Carmen is the one I told you about," Mrs. Patterson said with obvious affection. "The single mother who moved here after a difficult divorce. Stela took extra time with Carmen's daughter during that first difficult year." Ashley looked more closely at Carmen, recognizing in her face the kind of strength that comes from overcoming challenges through sheer determination and community support. Here was someone who'd rebuilt her life in Millbrook, established a successful business, raised a confident daughter, all with assistance from the woman Ashley had dismissed as irrelevant and out of touch. "Mrs. Jones didn't just help my daughter academically," Carmen said, settling into an empty chair with the easy grace of someone comfortable in any social situation. "She helped me understand how to navigate small-town community dynamics, introduced me to people who became clients for my event planning business, even recommended me for my first few jobs when I was just starting out." "I had no idea," Ashley said, and realized as she spoke the words how many times she'd said them this afternoon. How much of Stela's life had remained invisible to her, dismissed as unimportant rather than simply unobserved. "She's helped a lot of people over the years," Carmen continued. "But she's also someone who needs help sometimes, especially since Mr. Jones died. I think maybe that's what today is really about, showing her that she's not alone, that the community she's served is still here for her." The observation hit Ashley with the force of recognition. She'd been so focused on managing Stela as a family obligation that she'd never considered her mother-in-law might be struggling with loneliness, grief, the particular challenges of aging in a world that increasingly devalued older voices. Across the room, she could see Jake engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Walsh, both of them examining what appeared to be a chess set someone had brought out. Stela stood nearby, her face reflecting the kind of quiet joy that comes from watching beloved people connect with each other. "I think I owe Mrs. Jones an apology," Ashley said quietly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Maybe," Carmen replied with the diplomatic grace of someone who'd learned to navigate complicated social situations. "But I think what she'd appreciate even more is understanding. Recognition that she's not asking for special treatment because of her age. She's asking for the same respect and inclusion she's always earned through her actions and character." As the formal program began, a series of brief speeches and shared memories that painted a picture of Robert's impact on the community, Ashley found herself seeing the event through different eyes. This wasn't just a birthday celebration or even primarily a memorial service. It was a demonstration of the kind of community connections that develop over decades of genuine service, the networks of mutual support that make small towns function as more than just collections of individual households. When Bella Santos took the microphone to offer the day's final remarks, Ashley felt the full weight of her changed perspective. "Before we close," Bella said, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I want to say something about the woman who made today possible." Stela Jones organized this celebration to honor her husband's memory, but in doing so, she's reminded all of us why we value the wisdom and experience of our elders. Ashley felt David's hand find hers under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of support that acknowledged both her discomfort and her growth. "Too often, we live in separate worlds defined by our ages, our stages of life, our immediate concerns," Bella continued. "But events like this remind us that community is built through connections across generations, through the recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute, regardless of their age or circumstances." The words weren't directed specifically at Ashley, but she felt them as a personal challenge to examine her own assumptions about aging, relevance, and the value of different perspectives. As the formal program concluded and people began gathering their belongings, Ashley realized that the afternoon had changed something fundamental in her understanding of her place in this family and community. She'd arrived reluctantly, driven by social obligation and family pressure. She was leaving with genuine respect for what Stela had accomplished, and shame about her own previous blindness to her mother-in-law's worth. But more than that, she was leaving with a recognition that the work of building authentic family relationships required more than just managing appearances and avoiding conflict. It required seeing people clearly, honoring their contributions, and choosing connection over control. The conversation she'd requested with Stela still awaited, but Ashley now understood that it needed to be more than an apology. It needed to be the beginning of a completely different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than tolerance, understanding rather than management, genuine appreciation rather than obligation. As Jake ran up to show her a book about chess that Dr. Walsh had promised to lend him, Ashley felt the first genuine hope she'd experienced in months, that their family might find a way forward that honored everyone's dignity and worth. The last of the community center guests had departed by 6 o'clock, leaving behind the satisfied exhaustion that follows successful celebrations and the gentle chaos of cleanup. Paper plates bore traces of cake frosting, coffee cups clustered on tables like conversation circles frozen in time, and the scent of sunflowers still perfumed the air where Robert's memorial displays had transformed an ordinary community space into something sacred. Stela stood near the front table, carefully wrapping the photographs that had told the story of Robert's life throughout the afternoon. Each image carried new weight now, having been touched by dozens of hands, and accompanied by stories she'd never heard before. The chess photograph Jake had brought held pride of place in her hands, not because it was the most professional or artistic, but because it captured something essential about Robert's character that resonated with everyone who'd seen it. "Mrs. Jones?" Jim Walsh approached, carrying a large box that appeared to contain something substantial. His earlier assistance with setup had evolved throughout the day into something more like partnership, and Stela found herself grateful for his steady presence during what had proven to be an emotionally complex afternoon. "What do you have there?" she asked, noting the careful way he handled whatever the box contained. "Something I hoped might serve as a fitting conclusion to today's celebration." Jim's expression carried the particular mix of nervousness and anticipation that suggested he'd planned this moment carefully. "It's from all of us. the community members who wanted to contribute something lasting to Robert's memory. He opened the box to reveal a leather-bound photo album, its cover embossed with Robert's name and dates in elegant gold lettering. But as Stela opened it, she discovered it was far more than a simple memorial book. Each page contained photographs from today's celebration alongside older images that community members had contributed, creating a visual narrative that connected Robert's past impact to the present gathering organized in his honor. Everyone who came today signed the dedication page, Jim explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully coordinated a meaningful surprise. And Carmen Santos worked with Bella to create a section at the back where people could write stories about how Robert influenced their lives. Stela turned to the dedication page and felt her throat tighten as she read name after name of people who'd taken time to honor Robert's memory with their signatures and brief personal messages. Former students, teaching colleagues, neighbors, community volunteers. The breadth of representation told the story of a life that had touched countless others through simple acts of service and attention. I don't know what to say. She looked up at Jim, noting the gentle pleasure in his expression as he watched her discover each element of the gift. How did you organize all this? Eleanor Morrison supervised the logistics. Jim admitted with a smile. I just made sure all the pieces came together. Robert was important to this community, Stela, but so are you. Today proved that beyond any doubt. Before Stela could respond, she heard familiar voices approaching from the parking lot. David's laughter mixed with Jake's excited chatter as her family made their way back into the community center, apparently having taken a brief walk to allow the cleanup crew to work efficiently. Grandma Stela, Jake announced as he bounded through the door. Daddy said we could come back to help you carry stuff to your car, and I wanted to make sure my chess picture didn't get left behind. Your picture is safe, Stela assured him, holding up the carefully wrapped frame. In fact, it's going to have a place of honor in my living room, right next to the other photos of Grandpa Robert. Ashley entered behind David and Jake, her posture noticeably different from her earlier rigid formality. The afternoon's events had seemed to soften something in her bearing, replacing defensive tension with what might have been genuine thoughtfulness. Stela, Ashley said, her voice carrying a quality Stela hadn't heard before, vulnerability mixed with determination. Could we have that conversation now, if you're not too tired from everything today? Of course. Stela glanced around the nearly empty community center, recognizing that this conversation required privacy but uncertain about the appropriate setting. Would you like to go back to my house? Actually, Ashley said, surprising everyone, including herself. Could we talk here? This place feels appropriate somehow, like it represents what I'm trying to understand better. David lifted Emma, who had fallen asleep in her car seat, and settled into one of the remaining chairs, with the practiced ease of a father comfortable with managing sleeping children during adult conversations. Jake claimed the chair beside him, still clutching his promised chess book, and listening with the unguarded attention children bring to moments they sense are important. Ashley chose a chair facing Stela directly, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes meeting her mother-in-law's gaze with newfound directness. I owe you an apology, Ashley began, then paused, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the complexity of what she needed to express. Not just for what I said at Jake's party, although that was inexcusable. I owe you an apology for years of dismissing your importance, for treating you like someone to be managed rather than valued, for being so focused on building my own version of family that I failed to recognize the wisdom and experience you brought to our lives. The words carried weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement of specific wrongdoing. Ashley was apologizing for a pattern of behavior, a fundamental misunderstanding of relationship dynamics that had shaped years of family interactions. I've spent this afternoon listening to story after story about your impact on this community, Ashley continued. People whose lives you've touched, whose children you've taught, whose difficulties you've helped solve. And I realized that I've been living in the same house, sharing the same grandchildren, attending the same family gatherings as someone whose contributions to the world far exceed anything I've accomplished in my own career. Stela felt tears threatening as she recognized the courage it required for Ashley to offer such complete acknowledgement of her own failures. This wasn't a strategic apology designed to restore family peace. It was genuine recognition of harm done and value unrecognized. "Ashley," Stella said gently, "you're a wonderful mother, a successful professional, someone who's built a good life for your family. This isn't about comparing accomplishments." Quote, "Maybe not," Ashley replied, "but it is about respect. About recognizing that your age makes you more valuable, not less. About understanding that the years you've lived and the experiences you've had are resources our family should treasure, not obstacles to manage." She paused, looking toward Jake, who was listening with the serious attention he brought to conversations he sensed mattered deeply. "I think about the grandmother my children deserve to have, and I realize I've been preventing that relationship through my own fears and prejudices." Jake's wisdom today, his recognition that love and respect should triumph over adult pride, showed me how much I've been failing not just you, but my own children. "And what about moving forward?" Stella asked, recognizing that apologies, however heartfelt, required follow-through to create lasting change. Ashley's expression grew more determined. "I want to learn from you. I want my children to benefit from your wisdom and experience. I want to be the kind of daughter-in-law who honors what you bring to our family rather than someone who sees you as an inconvenience to be tolerated." She looked around the community center, taking in the evidence of the afternoon celebration. The flowers, the photographs, the testimony of lives touched by service and dedication. "And I want to understand what it really means to be part of a community like this. To contribute something meaningful beyond my own immediate family's needs." David shifted Emma to his other arm and reached for Ashley's hand, his expression reflecting both pride in her growth and relief that family healing might finally be possible. "There's something else," Ashley said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Sophia mentioned that you've been feeling isolated since Robert's death. I want you to know that doesn't have to continue. Our family gatherings, holiday celebrations, the children's activities, I want you to be involved in planning them, not just attending them. I want your input, your traditions, your ideas about what makes celebrations meaningful." Jake looked up from his chess book with the sudden attention children give to conversations that directly affect their understanding of family dynamics. "Does this mean Grandma Stela can help plan my next birthday party? Because I have some really good ideas about games, and I bet she knows even better ones." The innocent question brought laughter that felt cleansing rather than awkward, releasing tension that had built throughout the emotional conversation. "Yes, sweetheart," Ashley said, her voice warm with genuine affection as she looked at her son. "Grandma Stella can definitely help plan your next birthday party. In fact, I think we should ask her to be in charge of games, since she clearly has more experience making parties fun than I do." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the community center, Stella felt the kind of cautious hope that follows the resolution of long-standing conflicts. Words had been spoken, understanding had been reached, commitments had been made. But the real test would come in the months ahead, as they worked to build new relationship patterns based on mutual respect rather than careful management. But looking at Jake's satisfied expression, David's obvious relief, and Ashley's determined vulnerability, Stella felt confident that they'd taken the first genuine step toward becoming the kind of family Robert would have been proud to see, one that honored wisdom alongside youth, experience alongside innovation, connection alongside independence. The sunset painted Millbrook's harbor in shades of gold and amber as they walked toward their cars, and Stela carried with her not just the memory of a celebration well executed, but the promise of family relationships rebuilt on foundations strong enough to last. Robert's 70th birthday had been celebrated properly, surrounded by community, and marked by the kind of authentic connection that transcended simple memorial service. But more than that, it had become the catalyst for healing that would extend far beyond this single day, creating possibilities for the future that honored both the past and the potential for continued growth. As Jim Walsh walked her to her car, carrying the memorial album that would serve as a lasting reminder of the day's significance, Stella realized that sometimes the most powerful statements about worth and dignity come not from demanding recognition, but from creating opportunities for others to discover it naturally. Ashley had learned to see her differently, not through argument or confrontation, but through witnessing the evidence of a life well lived and community well served. The lesson would last far longer than any forced apology could have, creating authentic change rather than temporary peace. And perhaps that, more than any birthday celebration, was the gift Robert would have most wanted: a family finally learning to see each other clearly, to value each other completely, and to move forward together with the kind of love that transforms ordinary relationships into lasting bonds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,